April 19th, 1945. On the outskirts of Eichenberg, a shattered hamlet in the Thuringian forest. The air itself is a fine gray powder. It tastes of pulverized stone and lingering cordite. For 3 days, this cellar has been their world, a cramped, damp tomb smelling of sour earth and unwashed bodies. Anneliese Vogt, a 20-year-old nourishing Helferin, a signals auxiliary for the Wehrmacht, presses her cheek against the rough stone wall. It's cold. The cold is the only thing that feels real anymore. Above, the world has ended. The relentless, grinding rumble of American armor has replaced the familiar staccato of German machine gun fire. The earth no longer shudders from the impact of their own 88s, but from the concussive blasts of foreign artillery. She listens. The shouts outside are sharp, guttural, in a language she's only heard in propaganda films, English. It sounds wrong here, a violation of the very soil. Beside her, Margarita, a nurse nearly twice her age, with deep-set, exhausted eyes, slowly wraps a strip of torn linen around a younger girl's hand. The girl, barely 17, doesn't flinch. She just stares at the cellar door, her breathing shallow. There are 7 of them in total. 7 women in field gray auxiliary uniforms, their tasks once consisting of routing telephone calls, decoding messages, and plotting aircraft trajectories. Now, their only task is to breathe, quietly. The hunger is a living thing inside Anneliese. It's a dull, constant ache that has sharpened over the last 72 hours into a predator, gnawing at the lining of her stomach. Their last meal was a shared slice of stale rye bread and a canteen of lukewarm, metallic-tasting water. Before that, watery turnip soup. You stop thinking about home, about family, about the future. The world shrinks to the hollow space inside you, a void that screams to be filled. The propaganda posters of smiling soldiers sharing hearty rations seem like a cruel joke from another lifetime. Suddenly, a heavy boot scrapes on the stone steps outside. The thick wooden door groans open, flooding the cellar with a blinding slice of gray daylight. A silhouette fills the frame. It's huge, broad-shouldered, carrying a rifle that looks like a toy in its hands. An American. He wears a strange, pot-shaped helmet and a uniform the color of mud. He says something. The words are meaningless, but the tone is not. It's not angry, it's not cruel, it's tired, impatient. Another soldier appears behind him, this one holding a compact machine gun, a Thompson, Anneliese recognizes with a jolt of fear. He gestures with the barrel. Raus, out, schnell. The German words, spoken with a clumsy foreign accent, are clear enough. Margarita helps the young girl to her feet. One by one, they file out, blinking against the painful light. The world outside is a nightmare of splintered trees and collapsed buildings. The street is choked with rubble. And standing there, leaning against a half-track bearing a white star, are more of them. Dozens of American soldiers. They are so big, well-fed. Their faces are smudged with dirt and stubble, but their eyes are alert. They chew gum, they smoke cigarettes, they watch the small group of women emerge from the cellar with a mixture of curiosity and utter disinterest. This is not what the radio broadcasts had promised. Where is the snarling, depraved beast intent on destruction? These men just look weary, like factory workers at the end of a long shift. Anneliese feels a strange, disorienting wave of confusion wash over her. Her fear is still there, a cold knot in her gut, but it's now laced with something else, an unnerving sense of anticlimax. A lieutenant with a thin mustache and a clipboard consults a piece of paper, then barks an order. A sergeant points them toward the back of a canvas-covered GMC truck, the engine already rumbling. They are herded forward, their worn boots crunching on shattered glass. No one shoves them, no one shouts insults. The process is chillingly efficient, impersonal. As Anneliese places her hand on the truck's cold metal tailgate to pull herself up, she catches the eye of a young GI, no older than her. He isn't sneering, he isn't hostile. He just looks at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before turning away to light another cigarette. The distance in that glance is more terrifying than any threat. It's the look of a man processing material, not people. She and the others are no longer signals clerks or nurses. They are cargo. And as the canvas flap falls, plunging them into a swaying, diesel-fumed darkness, she has no idea where they are being shipped. The journey is a disorienting eternity of jolts and rumbles. Huddled in the back of the GMC truck, the 7 women are thrown against each other with every lurch and sway. The canvas walls offer no view, only shifting patterns of light and shadow that mark the passage of a sun they cannot see. The smell of exhaust fumes is thick and nauseating, mingling with the scent of damp wool and fear. No one speaks. There is nothing to say. The world as they knew it has been erased, and the blank page of what comes next is terrifying. Annalise focuses on the rhythmic squeak of the truck's suspension, a tiny, predictable sound in a universe of chaos. It's a flimsy anchor, but it's the only one she has. You try to piece together the world outside from sound alone, the crunch of gravel giving way to the squelch of mud, the distant, angry chatter of a machine gun, thankfully fading behind them, the unintelligible calls of American soldiers as their convoy occasionally slows or stops. Each halt is a spike of pure adrenaline. Is this it? Is this where they are taken out and shot, as the frantic final radio broadcasts had warned? But each time, the engine revs again, the gears grind, and the journey continues, deeper into enemy-held territory, deeper into the unknown. After what feels like hours, the truck slows, turns sharply, and comes to a final shuddering stop. The engine cuts out, and the sudden silence is deafening. Heavy footsteps approach. The canvas flap is thrown back, and once again, blinding daylight assaults their eyes. "Everybody out," a voice commands in English. They climb down stiffly, their legs aching. They are in a muddy farmyard, surrounded by a collection of half-ruined stone buildings. A large barn, its roof peppered with shrapnel holes, stands as the centerpiece. Dozens of other German prisoners are already here, a sea of gray uniforms. There are old men from the Volkssturm, their faces etched with disbelief, and boys from the Hitler Youth, their youthful arrogance shattered into a hollow-eyed terror. And then there are the soldiers, the weary, dirty, defeated remnants of what was once the most feared army in Europe. The women are separated from the men, guided by a weary gesture from a corporal toward the entrance of the barn. As they walk, Annalise sees the American camp. It's a picture of disciplined order amid the chaos. Jeeps are parked in neat lines, tents are erected with geometric precision. Men move with purpose, cleaning rifles, running communications wire, unloading crates. There is a sense of overwhelming, inexhaustible power here. It's a machine, and they are now just a handful of broken cogs caught in its gears. The barn is vast and dim, the air thick with the smell of old hay, manure, and the collective despair of over 100 captives. They are directed to a section of the floor already covered with a thin layer of straw. This is their new home. Marguerite immediately sets about checking on the other women, her nurse's instincts taking over even without medicine or supplies. Annalise simply sinks to the ground, her back against a rough wooden wall, and pulls her knees to her chest. The hours crawl by. The sun begins to set, casting long, distorted shadows through the holes in the roof. The cold deepens, seeping up from the packed earth floor. The gnawing hunger has become a monstrous physical presence, a burning hollowness that consumes all other thought. Whispers ripple through the barn, rumors, fears. Someone heard they are being shipped to America. Another swears they will be handed over to the Russians. A boy near Annalise begins to sob quietly, a desperate, hopeless sound that is quickly shushed by an older soldier. Darkness falls completely. The Americans post guards at the large barn doors, but otherwise leave them alone. There is no interrogation, no roll call, no food, no water. This deliberate neglect feels more cruel than active brutality. It is a statement. You are no longer a concern. You are simply being stored. Annalise closes her eyes, but sleep will not come. She can hear the stomach of the girl next to her rumbling loudly in the oppressive silence. She can feel her own body starting to tremble, partly from cold, partly from a profound weakness she has never known. The future has been reduced to a single, agonizing question that pounds in her head with every beat of her heart. Will they feed us, or will they just let us waste away in this dark, cold barn until we disappear? The night was a fever dream of cold and hunger. Sleep came only in brief, fitful bursts, punctuated by the groans of the wounded and the quiet weeping of the terrified. Annalise awoke to a gray, pre-dawn light filtering through the shrapnel holes in the barn roof. The air was frigid, her breath misting in front of her face. The gnawing ache in her stomach had become a constant, nauseating companion. She felt lightheaded, her movements slow and deliberate, as if moving through deep water. The despair of the previous night had settled into a kind of dull, resigned apathy. They were forgotten. This was how it would be. Then came the sound. It started as a low rumble, different from the tanks and half-tracks of the day before. It was a methodical, mechanical noise, a truck engine, idling just outside the main barn doors. A collective stirring went through the prisoners, heads lifted from the straw. Whispers turned to anxious murmurs. Was this the transport? Were they being moved again? The massive barn doors scraped open, not all the way, but just enough for 2 American soldiers to enter. They carried no weapons, only buckets. The prisoners fell silent, watching with a mixture of hope and terror. The soldiers walked to the center of the barn and simply set the large galvanized steel buckets down before turning and leaving without a word. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, a few of the bolder men crept forward to investigate. The report came back in a hushed, disbelieving whisper. Wasser. Water. A slow, orderly queue formed. The women were given precedence, a small, unspoken courtesy that felt strangely out of place. Annalise cupped her hands, and a soldier she hadn't seen before, a private with freckles and weary eyes, poured a small amount of cold, clean water into them. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It did nothing for the hunger, but it cleared her head, washing away the dusty, metallic taste of fear. They returned to their corner, a fragile sense of relief settling over them. They had not been forgotten entirely. But the relief was short-lived because it was followed by a smell. A smell so foreign, so powerful, it seemed to defy the very reality of their situation. It was the rich, almost sinfully aromatic scent of brewing coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter, roasted barley ersatz coffee they had been drinking for years. This was the genuine article, a ghost from a long-lost civilian life. Annalise watched, mesmerized, as a U.S. Army field kitchen, a rolling collection of burners and cauldrons on the back of a 2.5 truck, was fired up in the farmyard. Soldiers moved with practiced ease, opening large cans, stirring massive pots with paddles the size of oars. Steam began to billow into the cold morning air, carrying with it a new aroma. It was savory. It was meat, and onions, and something else, a deep, hearty scent that made her stomach clench with a pain that was half hunger, half pure, agonizing desire. This had to be a mistake, a cruel trick. This couldn't be for them. It was for the American soldiers, a morning feast before their day's work of conquering her homeland. She watched them, a lump forming in her throat. She saw them lining up, their metal mess kits clanking. But they weren't forming a line at the kitchen. They were forming a line to enter the barn. A young American lieutenant appeared at the doorway. He held a mess kit in his hand to demonstrate. He pointed to the prisoners, then to the kitchen outside, and made a simple eating motion. "Chow line," he said, the words alien. "Food. Come on." A wave of disbelief and suspicion washed through the barn. Go outside? Voluntarily? Margaret grabbed Annalise's arm, her voice a tense whisper. "Don't move. It could be a trick to get us all out in the open." The boy who had been sobbing the night before looked at his older comrade, who simply shook his head, his eyes narrowed with distrust. Why would the enemy feed them, and feed them this feast? Propaganda had been clear. The Americans were capitalists who would let you starve. They were barbarians. This act of apparent generosity made no sense. It was more frightening than a threat. It was a disruption of the world order as they had been taught it. But the hunger was a more powerful force than ideology. A few of the Folksturm men, old farmers with no fight left in them, began to slowly shuffle toward the door. Then a few more. Hesitantly, a line began to form, a gray procession of ghosts shuffling toward the impossible smell. Annalise felt a tremor run through her. Her body was screaming at her to go, to risk anything for what those pots held. Her mind, conditioned by years of war and propaganda, screamed at her to stay, to trust her fear. Margaret watched the first few men receive their food, unmolested, back into the barn. Her pragmatism won out. "Come," she said, her voice strained. "We must eat if we are to survive." Annalise rose on trembling legs, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She followed Margaret into the line, her eyes fixed on the steaming cauldron ahead. As she drew closer, she could see it clearly, a thick, brown stew, rich with chunks of beef, potatoes, and carrots. It didn't look real. It looked like a painting of food, a memory of a Sunday dinner from a childhood she could barely recall. The American soldier serving was a large man with a bored expression. He didn't look at her, just scooped a heavy ladleful of the stew and held it over the mess kit he had thrust into her hands. For a single, paralyzing second, Annalise couldn't move. Her hands shook as she held out the tin plate. This wasn't just a meal. It was a choice, a surrender, a step into a world that operated by rules she no longer understood. The weight of the food on the thin metal tray was shocking. Annalise's arms, weakened by days of deprivation, trembled under the load. The heat radiated upward, warming her face and hands, a stark contrast to the damp chill that had settled deep in her bones. She moved in a daze, following Marguerite back to their corner of the barn, her eyes locked on the stew. The other women in her small group followed, each carrying their own impossible portion. They sat in a tight circle on the straw, the silence between them thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. For a long moment, no one moved. They just stared at their food. It was an act of profound disbelief. This was more meat than Annalise had seen in a month. The potatoes were white and firm, not the gray, half-rotten things they'd been issued in the final weeks. The gravy was dark and glistening with fat. It was the fat that held her mesmerized. Fat was energy. Fat was life. Fat was a luxury that had vanished from Germany years ago. "You are a soldier of the Reich," a voice in her head, a remnant of a drill instructor's bark, reminded her. "You do not accept gifts from the enemy." But the animal part of her, the part that had been starved into dominance, was deaf to ideology. Her hand, acting of its own accord, lifted the small, flimsy fork that came with the kit. She scooped up a small piece of potato and a chunk of beef, coated in the thick gravy. She raised the fork to her mouth, her movement stiff, almost ceremonial. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. The smell alone was overwhelming, a rich, savory perfume that made her mouth flood with saliva. She finally put the food in her mouth. And the world exploded. It wasn't just a taste. It was a physical shock, a sensory detonation. The salt, the savory depth of the beef, the soft texture of the perfectly cooked potato, the impossible richness of the gravy. It was a symphony of flavors her palate had long forgotten. It was the taste of peace, the taste of a life before bombs and rations and constant grinding fear. The warmth spread from her tongue down her throat, a wave of liquid heat that seemed to push back against the permanent internal cold. It was so intensely, overwhelmingly good that it was painful. Her eyes snapped shut. A memory, unbidden and sharper than a photograph, flashed in her mind. Her mother, standing in their sunlit kitchen in Dresden, stirring a pot on the stove, the same rich smell filling the house. A Sunday before the war, a life that no longer existed, a city that was now a field of ashes, a mother she would likely never see again. A single hot tear escaped her closed eyelid and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She opened her eyes, trying to take another bite, but her hand was shaking uncontrollably. The fork clattered against the tin plate. Another tear followed the first. A choked, guttural sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped her throat. She tried to stifle it, pressing her free hand to her mouth, but it was no use. The dam had broken. Years of indoctrination, months of fear, weeks of retreat, days of starvation. It all came pouring out in a torrent of uncontrollable, racking sobs. The simple, profound act of kindness from her sworn enemy had accomplished what no artillery barrage or bombing raid ever could. It had utterly and completely broken her. Across the circle, the youngest girl, the 17-year-old, watched Annalise for a moment, her own fork halfway to her mouth. Then her face crumbled, and she too began to weep, her shoulders shaking silently. A few feet away, another woman let out a low, mournful wail. The sound was infectious. It spread through the clusters of women, then to some of the younger boys, and even a few of the hardened veteran soldiers. The simple act of eating a warm meal became an agony of memory and loss. The kindness was incomprehensible. It didn't compute. Brutality, they had been prepared for. Cruelty, they understood. But this compassion, this was a language they didn't speak, and the sheer emotional confusion of it was devastating. The American guards at the door, who had been watching the feeding with detached professionalism, now stood frozen, their faces a mixture of bewilderment and alarm. They exchanged confused glances. What was happening? Were the prisoners sick? Was the food poisoned? Sergeant Frank Miller of the 89th Infantry Division, a man who had seen combat from the Moselle to the Rhine, stepped into the barn to see what the commotion was. He stopped dead. The scene before him was one of the strangest he had ever witnessed in the war. The large, dim barn was filled with the sound of weeping. Dozens of German prisoners, women and boys, were crying into their meals, their bodies convulsing with a grief so raw and profound it seemed to shake the very air. They weren't angry, they weren't defiant, they were just broken. He looked from their tear-streaked faces to the steaming beef stew in their hands, and for the first time in a very long time, he had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. Sergeant Miller stood there for a long moment, the cacophony of sobbing washing over him. His first instinct, born of months of training and combat, was to restore order, to shout, to get control of the situation. But the sound wasn't one of rebellion. It was the sound of utter collapse. He looked at the faces. He saw the girl who couldn't be older than his sister back in Ohio, her shoulders heaving as she tried and failed to eat. He saw the older woman, the nurse, trying to comfort her, tears streaming down her own face. These weren't the arrogant fanatics he'd seen in newsreels. They weren't the hardened soldiers who had fought his platoon for every inch of ground just days ago. They were starving children. They were broken women. And they were crying because someone had given them a hot meal. The realization hit him not as a thought, but as a gut punch. He had been fighting an idea, a uniform, a gray tide of the enemy. Now, in this dusty barn, the idea had evaporated, leaving only this collection of miserable, hungry people. The war, for a moment, ceased to be about maps and objectives, and became about a bowl of stew. He turned to his men at the door. One of them, a private named O'Malley, looked at him with wide, confused eyes. "Sarge, what the hell is going on?" Miller's voice was low, rougher than usual. "Just back off," he said. "Give them some room. Leave the doors open." He walked back out into the farmyard, kneading the cold air on his face. The lieutenant in charge of the prisoners, a fresh-faced second lieutenant named Peters, jogged over. "What's the situation, Sergeant? Are they rioting?" "No, sir," Miller said, shaking his head slowly. "They're not rioting. I think the beef stew is the problem." "Peters? What's wrong with it? Nothing's wrong with it, sir. That's the problem. The lieutenant was silent, trying to parse the non-military logic of the statement. Miller didn't try to explain further. How could you explain something you barely understood yourself? How do you file a report that says the enemy surrendered its will to fight, not to a bayonet, but to a ladle? He walked over to the field kitchen. The cooks were already cleaning the massive pots. "Hey," Miller called out, "you still got coffee in that urn?" "Sure, Sarge. A few gallons left." "Got any extra sugar? Real sugar?" The cook nodded, pointing to a sack. "Plenty." Miller grabbed a stack of tin cups. He filled one with hot black coffee and stirred in 3 heaping spoons of sugar until it was practically syrup. He walked back to the barn entrance. The wave of intense sobbing had subsided into a low murmur of quiet, exhausted crying. He scanned the prisoners, and his eyes landed on the young woman he'd seen first, Annalise. She was staring at the half-eaten meal in her lap as if it were a venomous snake, her face pale and tracked with tears. Slowly, carefully, he walked over to her. She flinched as his shadow fell over her, her body tensing, expecting a blow. The other women in her circle watched him with wide, fearful eyes. He crouched down, not too close, and held out the cup. He didn't speak. He just offered it. Annalise stared at the cup, then at his face. His expression wasn't angry or mocking. It was awkward, uncomfortable, human. Hesitantly, her trembling hands reached out and took the cup from him. The metal was hot. She brought it to her lips and took a small sip. The shock of the sweetness, so pure and potent, was almost as powerful as the stew had been. It was a jolt of pure energy. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. Why? He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, then stood up and walked away, leaving her and the others in peace. That small, silent exchange changed everything. The fear, while not gone, receded. The rigid barrier between captor and captive, enemy and victor, became porous, indistinct. In its place was a quiet, somber understanding. Over the next hour, the prisoners finished their meal. They ate slowly, deliberately, as if learning the mechanics of it all over again. The barn was quiet now, save for the scraping of forks on tin. When they were done, they formed an orderly line to return the mess kits. No one spoke, but the way they moved was different. The hard, defiant shell was gone. In its place was a fragile, raw vulnerability. They looked at the American soldiers, not with hatred, but with a weary, profound confusion. For Annalise, the world had been irrevocably tilted on its axis. The entire foundation of her belief system, built on the righteousness of her nation and the barbarity of its enemies, had been washed away by a bowl of stew. The future was still a terrifying void, a prisoner of war camp, an uncertain fate. But the present moment, in this cold and dusty barn, held an impossible, shimmering truth. Even at the end of the world, a simple act of human decency could be the most powerful weapon of all.